The autumn wind swept through the streets of Ridgewood, a small town nestled in the heart of West Virginia, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant promise of rain. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the local diner served the same coffee it had for 30 years, and where the word of a handshake still meant something. Or at least, it used to. On this particular October afternoon, the town square was alive with the buzz of an unexpected gathering. Campaign banners fluttered from every lamppost, bearing the face of a man named Harold Bennington III, a state senator with ambitions that stretched far beyond these quiet hills. His smile, perfectly practiced and professionally whitened, beamed down from every surface, promising change, prosperity, and a future brighter than any Ridgewood had ever seen. But promises, as the people of this town would soon learn, are sometimes nothing more than carefully constructed lies. At the edge of town, past the old railroad tracks and beyond the abandoned textile mill that had once been the lifeblood of the community, stood a weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read, Iron Brotherhood Clubhouse. The paint was faded, the wood was worn, but the spirit of the place remained unbroken. This was home to the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club, a group of men and women who had found in each other what the world had failed to provide: loyalty, purpose, and a family bound not by blood, but by choice. Marcus Cole sat on the worn leather couch in the main room, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. At 52, his face told the story of a life lived hard, but honest. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter shared with brothers on the open road. The scar along his jaw whispered of a firefight in Fallujah that had taken 3 of his squad mates and left him with nightmares that still visited on quiet nights. His silver hair pulled back into a short ponytail, and his full beard gave him the look of a man who had seen too much but still believed in something worth fighting for. He was the president of the Iron Brotherhood, a position he had never sought but had accepted when the previous leader, old Samuel Wright, had passed away 3 winters ago. Under his guidance, the club had transformed from a group of outlaws the town once feared into a community pillar that organized charity rides for veterans, ran a free motorcycle repair workshop for kids who needed direction, and showed up whenever a family needed help that no government agency would provide. The door to the clubhouse swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and a woman who carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that needed no announcement. This was Elena Vasquez, the club's vice president and Marcus's closest friend. Her dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and her leather vest bore patches that told of her own military service and her rise through the ranks of the Brotherhood. She needs to see this, she said, her voice carrying the weight of urgency as she crossed the room and turned on the old television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, revealing a press conference in progress. Senator Harold Bennington stood behind a podium decorated with the state seal, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the working-class crowd that had gathered to hear him speak. Behind him, a row of men in dark suits stood with their hands clasped before them, their expressions carefully neutral. "Ladies and gentlemen," the senator was saying, his voice rich with practiced sincerity, "I stand before you today to announce an initiative that will transform our beloved Appalachian communities. For too long, our veterans have returned home to find nothing waiting for them. No jobs, no support, no hope. That changes now." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the screen. "The Bennington Veterans Initiative will invest $50 million into job training, housing assistance, and mental health services for our heroes," the senator continued. "And I am proud to announce that we will be partnering with local organizations to ensure these resources reach those who need them most." The camera cut to a wide shot of the crowd, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten. There, in the front row, sat a group of veterans he recognized. Men and women from the local VFW hall, their faces lit with hope as they listened to promises that sounded too good to be true. Because they were. Elena muted the television and turned to face Marcus. "He reached out to us yesterday," she said. "Wants to meet. Says he needs the club's help with some community event to launch the initiative." "What kind of help?" "The kind that involves us standing behind him at a press conference, looking like we support him, like we endorse what he is doing." Marcus set down his coffee cup and rose to his feet. The leather of his vest creaked as he moved, the patches sewn onto it catching the dim light. One patch bore the Marine Corps emblem. Another showed the club's insignia, an iron fist clutching a wrench surrounded by the words brotherhood, loyalty, truth. And what is he actually doing? Marcus asked. That is what I'm trying to find out, Elena replied. I have been making calls, talking to people in the capital. Something does not add up, Marcus. This initiative of his, on paper, it looks legitimate. But the money trail? It is a maze. And there are whispers that the contracts for the job training programs are going to companies owned by his campaign donors. So he is using veterans as props to funnel money to his friends. It gets worse. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photograph. She handed it to Marcus, and he studied the image. It showed a rundown building on the outskirts of a neighboring town, a sign above the door reading Bennington Veterans Resource Center. The windows were boarded up. The parking lot was empty except for a single car with government plates. This is supposed to be one of his flagship facilities, Elena said. It has been open for 6 months. I drove out there yesterday. The door was locked. Nobody has been helped there. Ever. Marcus handed back the phone, his jaw tightening. And he wants us to put our names on this? He wants the image, the optics. A bunch of bikers, especially ones who are veterans standing behind him. It makes him look like a man of the people, like someone who cares about the forgotten communities. The door to the clubhouse opened again, and more members of the club began filing in for the evening meeting. There was Thomas Ridge, a former Army medic whose gentle hands had saved more lives than he could count. Behind him came the Patterson brothers, Eli and Jacob, twins who had served together in the same infantry unit and now ran a small engine repair shop in town. Maria Santos entered next, a former Marine who had lost her left leg below the knee to an IED and now walked with a prosthetic she had decorated with the club's colors. They gathered around the central table, their faces expectant. Word had spread about the senator's invitation, and everyone wanted to know what Marcus would decide. Elena explained the situation, laying out everything she had discovered. The room grew quiet as the truth sank in. These men and women had served their country with honor. They had seen friends fall on foreign soil. They had returned home to a nation that often seemed to forget their sacrifices. And now, a wealthy politician wanted to use their image to deceive the very communities they had sworn to protect. The silence stretched until Thomas spoke up. My cousin Danny applied for help through that initiative 6 months ago, he said, his voice low. He lost his job after his PTSD made it hard to function. He is still waiting, still homeless, still sleeping in his car behind the Quick Mart. My aunt applied for the housing assistance, Maria added. They told her she qualified. Then nothing. No calls, no follow-up. She is 73 years old and living with 3 other families in a 2-bedroom apartment. Marcus looked around the table at the faces of his brothers and sisters. He saw anger, yes, but more than that, he saw determination. These were not people who looked away when something was wrong. These were people who acted. So what do we do? Asked Eli Patterson. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. We take the meeting, he said. We hear what he has to say, and then we find out exactly what he is hiding. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Plans began to form. Elena would continue her investigation, digging deeper into the financial records. Thomas would reach out to veterans who had applied for help and document their experiences. Maria would contact a journalist she knew at the regional newspaper, someone who had written favorable stories about the club's charity work in the past. But Marcus knew that information alone would not be enough. Senator Bennington was a powerful man with powerful friends. Taking him down would require more than evidence. It would require strategy, timing, and an understanding of how men like him thought. The meeting with the senator was scheduled for the following afternoon at the Ridgewood Community Center. Marcus would go, along with Elena and a handful of other members. They would listen. They would smile. They would play the part of the simple bikers the senator expected them to be, and then they would begin to unravel everything he had built on lies. As the meeting concluded and the members began to disperse, Marcus stepped outside into the cooling evening air. The stars were beginning to emerge above the mountains, pinpricks of light in an endless darkness. He thought about the oath he had taken so many years ago, Not the one he had sworn as a Marine, but the one he had made to himself after coming home. He had promised that he would never again stand by while the powerful preyed upon the weak. He had promised that he would use whatever strength he had left to protect those who could not protect themselves. Senator Bennington had made a mistake in coming to Ridgewood. He had looked at the Iron Brotherhood and seen nothing but a useful image, a group of rough-looking men and women who could be bought with flattery and false promises. He had not seen the truth that lay beneath the leather and the chrome. He had not seen the warriors. And soon, he would learn what happened when warriors discovered they were being used. The night settled over Ridgewood like a blanket, and somewhere in the distance, a lone motorcycle engine rumbled to life, its sound echoing off the hills. Marcus listened until the sound faded into silence, then turned and walked back inside. Tomorrow, the game would begin. But the ending had already been written. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If these stories of courage and justice speak to your heart, if you believe that truth should never bow to power, then join this community. Hit that subscribe button and become part of something bigger than yourself. Every subscriber is another voice in the chorus that refuses to stay silent. The Ridgewood Community Center had stood at the corner of Main Street and Liberty Avenue for nearly 60 years. Its red brick facade had witnessed countless town meetings, wedding receptions, and high school dances. The hardwood floors still bore the scuff marks of 1,000 shoes, and the walls were lined with photographs documenting the town's history from the coal mining days to the present. On this October afternoon, the center had been transformed. Campaign workers had arrived at dawn, hanging banners and setting up a small stage at one end of the main hall. A catering company from the capital had brought in trays of food that looked nothing like what the locals were accustomed to seeing. Tiny sandwiches with the crusts cut off, exotic cheeses, and sparkling water in glass bottles. Senator Harold Bennington stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. His handshake was firm, his smile unwavering, his memory for names seemingly flawless. He moved through the room like a man who had spent his entire life learning how to make people feel important while caring nothing for them at all. At precisely 2 p.m, the rumble of motorcycle engines announced the arrival of the Iron Brotherhood. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the street outside the community center. Through the large windows, the campaign workers watched as a convoy of gleaming machines rolled into the parking lot, their chrome catching the weak autumn sunlight. Marcus dismounted first, removing his helmet and running a hand through his silver hair. Elena was beside him, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. Behind them came Thomas, Maria, and the Patterson brothers, each one wearing their club vest with the quiet pride of people who had earned every patch. The senator emerged from the community center, his smile widening as he approached the group with his hand already extended. He was flanked by 2 men in dark suits who said nothing, but watched everything. "You must be Marcus Cole," the senator said, grasping Marcus's hand with both of his own. "I have heard so much about you and your club. The work you do for this community is truly inspiring." Marcus nodded, his expression neutral. "Senator, thank you for the invitation. Please, call me Harold." The senator gestured toward the community center. "Come inside. I have something I would like to discuss with you and your colleagues." They followed him into the building, past the campaign workers who paused in their tasks to stare at the bikers, past the tables laden with food that no one had touched, to a small conference room at the back of the hall. The senator closed the door behind them and took a seat at the head of the table. "Let me be direct with you," he began, leaning forward with an expression of earnest concern. "I am a man who believes in action over words. I have spent the past 2 years developing the Bennington Veterans Initiative because I have seen firsthand how our heroes are being failed by the system." Marcus listened without speaking, his hands resting on the table before him. The senator continued, painting a picture of a state transformed by his leadership. He spoke of job creation, of housing programs, of mental health facilities that would be the finest in the nation. He spoke of his own family's military history, his grandfather who had served in Korea, his father who had been wounded in Vietnam. He spoke with the practiced fluency of a man who had given this speech 100 times before. And then he came to the point. "I need allies," the senator said. "Not just donors or endorsements from politicians. I need real people, People who understand what our veterans have been through. People who can speak to the communities I am trying to help." He paused, his eyes moving from face to face around the table. "I need the Iron Brotherhood." "In what capacity?" Elena asked, her voice carefully measured. "I have a major announcement scheduled for next week," the senator replied. "A groundbreaking ceremony for a new Veterans Resource Center right here in Ridgewood, the largest facility of its kind in the state. I want you there, all of you, standing with me as we break ground on a future our veterans deserve." Marcus exchanged a glance with Elena. "And what exactly would our role be?" The senator smiled, the expression of a man who believed he was about to close a deal. "Visible support. Your presence alone sends a message that this initiative has the backing of the people who matter most. In return, I am prepared to make a significant donation to your club's charitable activities. $50,000. No strings attached." The room was silent for a moment. Then Thomas spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "We would need to know more about the initiative before we could commit to anything. Details about the programs, how the money is being spent, who is benefiting." The senator's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Of course. I will have my staff send over all the relevant documentation. I have nothing to hide." He rose from his chair and extended his hand to Marcus. "Take some time to consider my offer. But do not take too long. The ceremony is in 1 week, and there is a great deal of work to be done." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the softness of the senator's palm. "Thank you for meeting with us," he said. "We will be in touch." As the bikers filed out of the conference room and made their way back to their motorcycles, the senator watched from the window. His smile remained in place, but his eyes had grown cold. One of the suited men approached him. "Do you think they will cooperate?" The senator straightened his tie. "They are simple people with simple needs. A little money, a little recognition, and they will fall in line." He turned away from the window. They always do. But Harold Bennington had made the fundamental error of underestimating his opponents. He saw leather vests and motorcycles and assumed he was dealing with people who could be bought with pocket change. He did not see the military training, the investigative skills, the network of connections that spanned the state. He did not see the years of community service that had built trust in places his money could never reach. Most importantly, he did not see the alliance that was already forming against him. That evening, the Iron Brotherhood gathered in their clubhouse once more. The mood was different now, charged with purpose. Elena had spent the afternoon making calls, and what she had discovered only confirmed their worst suspicions. "The documentation the senator promised," she said, spreading papers across the central table. "It arrived an hour ago. Pages and pages of nothing. Vague projections, inflated budget numbers, not a single concrete detail about where the money has actually gone." Marcus studied the documents, his brow furrowed. "What about the resource centers? The ones that are supposed to already be operating?" Thomas stepped forward, a laptop in his hands. "I spent the day driving to 3 of them. One is a storage facility. One is an empty office with no staff. The third..." He turned the laptop so everyone could see the screen. "This is supposed to be a job training center. Look at it." The image showed a decrepit building with a collapsed roof, vines growing through the broken windows. A sign out front read Bennington Veterans Opportunity Center. The parking lot was littered with debris. "I talked to the man who owns the property," Thomas continued. "The state pays him rent every month. Has been for 2 years, but no one has ever shown up to actually run anything." "So the money is going somewhere," Marcus said slowly. "Just not to veterans." Maria raised her hand. "I reached out to my contact at the newspaper, Sarah Chen. She has been trying to investigate the initiative for months, but every time she gets close to something, the paper's editors shut her down." "Pressure from above?" asked Eli Patterson. His brother Jacob snorted. "Probably from advertisers who are also donors to the senator's campaign." Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. They had always known that politics was a dirty game, but this was different. This was a systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable people in their community, wrapped in the flag and sold as patriotism. He thought about the veterans he knew who were struggling. Danny, Thomas's cousin, living in his car because the help he had been promised never came. Maria's aunt, crowded into an apartment meant for a family half her size. And countless others, men and women who had given years of their lives in service to a country that seemed to have forgotten them the moment they returned home. This ended now. He turned back to face his brothers and sisters. We have 1 week before that groundbreaking ceremony. 1 week to find out exactly where that money is going and who is benefiting. 1 week to build a case so strong that even the senator's friends will not be able to protect him. And then, Elena asked, then we make sure the world knows the truth. The room hummed with energy as assignments were distributed. Thomas would continue documenting the failed facilities, photographing and interviewing anyone willing to talk. Maria would work with Sarah Chen to gather financial records through sources inside the state bureaucracy. The Patterson brothers would reach out to veterans who had applied for assistance and collect their stories. Elena would coordinate everything, building a timeline that connected the senator's public promises with the reality of what his initiative had actually accomplished. And Marcus would do what he did best. He would wait and watch and prepare for the moment when all the pieces came together. Because Senator Bennington was about to learn a lesson that no amount of money or political power could protect him from. When you come for the people a brotherhood has sworn to protect, the brotherhood comes for you. The week that followed was one of the most intense the Iron Brotherhood had ever experienced. By day, the members went about their regular lives, working at their jobs, maintaining their motorcycles, and participating in the community activities that had made them pillars of Ridgewood. By night, they transformed into investigators, their clubhouse becoming a war room filled with documents, photographs, and maps marked with colored pins. Thomas Ridge proved to be an invaluable asset. His medical background had given him connections throughout the healthcare system, and those connections opened doors that would have remained closed to others. Within 3 days, he had documented 17 veterans who had applied for assistance through the Bennington Initiative and received nothing. Their stories were heartbreaking in their similarity. Initial enthusiasm followed by bureaucratic delays, promises of callbacks that never came, forms submitted and lost, lives put on hold waiting for help that existed only on paper. One veteran, a former Navy corpsman named James Whitfield, had applied for housing assistance after losing his job due to a service-connected disability. He had been living in a tent behind the elementary school where he had once attended classes as a child. When Thomas found him, James was suffering from pneumonia, but refused to go to the hospital because he could not afford the bills. They told me I was approved, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 months ago. Said the check was coming, then nothing. Nobody answers the phone anymore. Thomas brought him to the clubhouse, where Maria's medical training allowed her to stabilize him until they could arrange transport to a VA hospital 2 hours away. It was a small victory, but it reminded everyone why they were fighting. Meanwhile, Maria's contact at the newspaper was making progress of her own. Sarah Chen was a young journalist with more courage than job security, and she had been quietly building a case against the senator for months. When Maria reached out, Sarah recognized an opportunity to finally break through the wall of silence that had surrounded her investigation. They met at a diner on the outskirts of town, far from the eyes of anyone who might report back to the senator's people. Sarah arrived with a laptop bag filled with documents she had obtained through public records requests and unnamed sources inside the state government. The money trail is the key, Sarah explained, spreading printouts across the table. On paper, the Bennington Initiative has disbursed $43 million in the past 2 years. But when you trace where that money actually went, she showed them the records. Company after company, all with addresses that led to post office boxes or empty offices, board members who were relatives or campaign donors of the senator, contracts awarded without competitive bidding, invoices for services that were never rendered. The biggest recipient is something called Apex Solutions, Sarah continued. On paper, they provide job training and career counseling. They have received $18 million from the initiative. And in reality, Elena asked. In reality, Apex Solutions is owned by a shell company registered in Delaware. That shell company is owned by another shell company in Nevada. And that company? She paused for effect. It is controlled by a trust whose beneficiary is the senator's brother-in-law. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. So he is funneling public money meant for veterans directly into his own family's pockets. And he has been doing it for years, Sarah confirmed. The initiative was designed from the beginning to be a money laundering operation. The veterans were never supposed to be helped. They were just cover. The evidence was damning, but it was not yet complete. They needed something more. Something that would connect the senator directly to the scheme in a way that could not be explained away or blamed on subordinates. That opportunity came from an unexpected source. 3 days before the groundbreaking ceremony, a man appeared at the clubhouse asking to speak with Marcus. He was in his late 30s, with the nervous energy of someone who had made a decision and was terrified of the consequences. His name was Richard Harmon, and until 1 week ago, he had been the chief financial officer of Apex Solutions. I knew something was wrong, Richard said, his hands trembling as he sat at the table in the clubhouse. The numbers never made sense. We had contracts for services we never provided, employees who never showed up to work, but every time I asked questions, I was told to mind my own business. Marcus studied the man carefully. So why are you here now? Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive, because I finally got access to the real books, the ones they did not want anyone to see. He placed the drive on the table. Everything is there, the shell companies, the wire transfers, emails between the senator and my supervisors instructing them exactly how to structure the payments to avoid detection. Elena took the drive, her expression unreadable. Why bring this to us? Why not go to law enforcement? Richard laughed bitterly. You think I did not try? I went to the state attorney general's office 3 weeks ago. The next day I was fired. The day after that, someone broke into my apartment and took my computer. He shook his head. These people have connections everywhere. They have spent years building a system that protects them. The only way to take them down is to go public in a way that cannot be ignored. Marcus exchanged a glance with Elena. And what do you want in return? Just to do the right thing, Richard said. I have a daughter. She is 7 years old. Someday she is going to ask me what I did when I found out the truth. I want to be able to look her in the eye and tell her I stood up. The flash drive contained everything they needed and more. Detailed financial records showing exactly how the money had flowed from public coffers into private pockets. Email chains between the senator, his campaign manager, and the executives of Apex Solutions, discussing how to structure the scheme to avoid scrutiny. Even a recording of a phone call in which Senator Bennington personally instructed someone to delay all veteran applications until after the upcoming election. The evidence was overwhelming. Now they needed to decide how to use it. The night before the groundbreaking ceremony, the Iron Brotherhood gathered one final time. Sarah Chen was present, along with Richard Harmon and 2 veterans who had agreed to share their stories publicly. The plan was simple but bold. They would attend the ceremony as the senator expected. They would stand behind him as he broke ground on his fraudulent resource center. They would smile for the cameras and shake his hand. And then, at the moment of his greatest triumph, they would reveal the truth. Elena had arranged for the evidence to be distributed simultaneously to every major news outlet in the state. Sarah would live-stream the confrontation from her phone, ensuring that even if the local media tried to suppress the story, it would already be spreading across the internet. The veterans would speak about what the initiative had done to them, or rather what it had failed to do. Richard would present his evidence and explain exactly how the scheme had operated, and Marcus would deliver a message that Senator Harold Bennington would never forget. As the meeting concluded and the members prepared to leave, Maria spoke up. Before we go, she said, I want everyone to think about why we are doing this. It is not about bringing down a politician. It is not about revenge or glory. It is about the people who trusted a system that was designed to fail them. It is about James Whitfield, who almost died waiting for help that was never coming. It is about every veteran who believed the promises and was betrayed. She paused, her eyes moving from face to face. Tomorrow, we become their voice. We speak for those who have been silenced. We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then, one by one, the members of the Iron Brotherhood nodded their agreement. This was not just a confrontation. This was justice. And nothing Senator Bennington could do would stop it from coming. If this story is touching your heart right now, pause and leave a comment saying, "Justice for those who served." Let the world know that you stand with those who have been forgotten. Your words have power. Use them. The morning of the groundbreaking ceremony dawned gray and cold, the kind of autumn day that seemed to promise nothing good. Low clouds hung over the mountains surrounding Ridgewood, and a light mist dampened the streets as the town slowly came to life. At the site of the future Bennington Veterans Resource Center, workers had been preparing since before sunrise. A small stage had been erected, draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Rows of folding chairs faced the stage, and a podium stood at the center, bearing the senator's campaign logo. Behind the stage, a bulldozer waited to perform the ceremonial groundbreaking, its yellow paint garish against the gray sky. Senator Harold Bennington arrived in a black SUV at precisely 9 in the morning, 1 hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. He was accompanied by his wife, a former beauty queen named Carolyn, whose smile had been perfected through years of public appearances, and his campaign manager, a thin man named Douglas Price, whose eyes never stopped moving. The senators surveyed the scene with satisfaction. The local news crews were setting up their equipment. The chairs were already half filled with supporters bussed in from the Capitol, each one wearing a campaign button and carrying a small American flag. Everything was proceeding according to plan. "The bikers?" Price asked quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd. "They confirmed their attendance last night," the senator replied. "They will be here." He straightened his tie and smiled. "After today, no one will be able to question my commitment to veterans. The image of those bikers standing behind me will be worth more than any campaign advertisement." He had no idea how right he was. At 10 minutes before the hour, the rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the streets of Ridgewood. The sound grew louder, closer, until a convoy of gleaming chrome and black leather rolled into view. The crowd turned to watch as the Iron Brotherhood arrived in force, not just the handful of members the senator had expected, but nearly 50 riders, their formation precise and intimidating. Marcus Cole led the procession, his face expressionless behind his dark sunglasses. He dismounted smoothly, removing his helmet and taking his place at the front of the group. Elena stood beside him, and behind them ranged the full strength of the club, veterans all, their service patches visible on their vests. The senator's smile widened as he approached the group. "Marcus," he said warmly, "I am so glad you could make it, and you brought friends." He gestured toward the stage. "Please take your places. We are about to begin." Marcus nodded without speaking, and the bikers filed into the area behind the stage. To the watching crowd, they appeared to be exactly what the senator had hoped, a powerful visual endorsement of his initiative. The cameras captured the image, beaming it out to viewers across the state. None of them suspected what was about to happen. The ceremony began with the usual rituals. A local minister offered a prayer. A high school choir sang the national anthem. The mayor of Ridgewood gave a brief speech praising the senator's vision and thanking him for choosing their town as the site for this historic facility. And then Senator Bennington took the podium. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion. He spoke of sacrifice and service. He spoke of the debt the nation owed to its veterans. He spoke of his own family's military history, the same stories he had told in the community center, polished now to a high gloss for the cameras. And as he spoke, Marcus watched and waited. The moment came when the senator invited the audience to look behind him at the men and women who represented the true spirit of American patriotism. The bikers of the Iron Brotherhood, he declared, understand what it means to serve. They have answered my call to stand with us today because they know that this initiative will change lives. They know that together we can build a future worthy of our heroes. Marcus stepped forward. "May I say a few words?" The senator hesitated, his smile flickering almost imperceptibly. He had not planned for this. but the cameras were watching, and the crowd was already murmuring with approval. To refuse would look strange. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. "Please." Marcus approached the podium, his boots heavy on the wooden stage. He looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at the senator standing just a few feet away, and then he began to speak. "My name is Marcus Cole," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "I served 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. I have seen what war does to men and women. I have held friends as they died. I have come home to a country that sometimes seems to have forgotten the sacrifices we made." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. When Senator Bennington came to us, he promised that his initiative would help veterans like me and my brothers and sisters. He promised resources. He promised support. He promised that no veteran would be left behind. He paused, letting the moment stretch. He lied. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The senator's face had gone pale. "Over the past week, my club has conducted an investigation into the Bennington Veterans Initiative," Marcus continued. "What we found was not just disappointing, it was criminal." He turned and gestured to Elena, who stepped forward with a stack of documents. She began distributing copies to the nearest journalists as Marcus continued speaking. $43 million has been funneled through this initiative over the past 2 years. Not a single dollar has reached the veterans it was meant to help. Instead, the money has been diverted to shell companies owned by the senator's family members and campaign donors, resource centers that exist only on paper, job training programs that have never trained a single person. He looked directly at the senator now, his eyes hard. While veterans like James Whitfield slept in tents because the help they were promised never came, you and your friends were getting rich. The crowd erupted. Reporters began shouting questions. The senator's campaign manager was speaking urgently into his phone. And through it all, Sarah Chen's phone captured every moment, streaming live to an audience that was growing by the second. Thomas Ridge stepped forward, leading James Whitfield to the stage. The veteran was still weak from his recent illness, but he stood tall, his dignity intact despite everything he had endured. "My name is James Whitfield," he said, his voice steady. "I served 8 years in the Navy. I was wounded in service to my country. When I came home, I could not work. I could not afford a place to live. I applied for help through this initiative because I believed the promises. I am still waiting." More veterans came forward, each one sharing their story. A mother of 3 who had served in the Army and now worked 2 jobs while waiting for the housing assistance that never came. A former Marine who had lost his business while bureaucrats shuffled his paperwork from desk to desk. An elderly veteran of Vietnam who had been told his application was approved, only to find that the resource center he was supposed to visit did not exist. With each story, the senator's composure crumbled a little more. Finally, Richard Harmon took the stage. He identified himself as the former CFO of Apex Solutions, the company at the center of the scheme, and he presented the evidence he had gathered: the shell companies, the wire transfers, the emails, the recordings. "Senator Bennington knew exactly what was happening," Richard said. "He designed this scheme himself. I have the evidence to prove it." By the time he finished, the crowd was in an uproar. Some of the senator's supporters were trying to leave, embarrassed to be associated with him. Others were demanding answers, their anger building as they realized how thoroughly they had been deceived. The senator stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Marcus approached him one final time, leaning close so only the senator could hear. "You thought we were simple people," he said quietly. "You thought you could buy us with pocket change and use us as props for your photo opportunity." He stepped back, his expression cold. "You were wrong." The ceremony dissolved into chaos. Police officers arrived, summoned by someone in the crowd who had finally done their job. State investigators followed, drawn by the evidence that was now being broadcast across the state. Reporters surrounded the senator, shouting questions he could not answer. And through it all, the Iron Brotherhood stood together, watching as justice was served. The days following the ceremony were a whirlwind of activity. The story exploded across local, state, and national news, each outlet competing to uncover new details about the senator's scheme. Sarah Chen's live stream had been viewed over 2 million times before the end of the first day, and her subsequent articles provided the depth and context that transformed the story from a local scandal into a national conversation about political corruption. Senator Harold Bennington was arrested at his home 3 days after the ceremony. The charges included fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and theft of government funds. His brother-in-law was arrested the same day, along with the executives of Apex Solutions and several other companies that had participated in the scheme. The state attorney general, who had previously ignored Richard Harmon's warnings, found himself facing questions about his own involvement. Within a week, he had announced his resignation, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. But for Marcus and the Iron Brotherhood, the arrests were only the beginning of the work that needed to be done. Tearing down a corrupt system was one thing. Building something better in its place was another challenge entirely. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the club hosted a gathering at their clubhouse. It was not a celebration, but a planning session, bringing together veterans, community leaders, and advocates from across the state. The goal was simple: to ensure that the resources stolen by the senator's scheme would finally reach the people who needed them. "The money is still out there," Elena explained, addressing the crowded room. "The federal government has frozen the accounts of the shell companies involved in the fraud. There is a legal process underway to recover those funds and redirect them to legitimate veteran services." "How long will that take?" asked a young veteran named Kevin Martinez, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to find that his job had been eliminated and his apartment rented to someone else. "Months, maybe years," Elena admitted. "The legal system moves slowly, but that does not mean we have to wait." She outlined a plan the club had been developing. Using their own resources and donations from supporters who had been moved by their stand against the senator, the Iron Brotherhood would establish a temporary assistance fund for veterans in immediate need. They would partner with existing organizations, the VFW, local churches, and community groups, to identify those who needed help most urgently. It would not solve everything, but it would be a start. Marcus stood at the back of the room, watching as the conversation unfolded. He saw hope in the faces of the veterans who had felt forgotten. He saw determination in the eyes of the community members who had decided to stop waiting for someone else to fix their problems. And he saw something else, something that reminded him why he had joined the Iron Brotherhood in the first place. He saw brotherhood, not just among the bikers who wore the club's patches, but among everyone in the room. People who had been strangers a month ago were now working together toward a common goal. Divisions of class and race and politics melted away in the face of a shared purpose. This was what community was supposed to look like. Over the following months, the temporary assistance fund grew beyond anything Marcus had imagined. Donations poured in from across the country, from veterans and civilians alike, all moved by the story of a small motorcycle club that had stood up to a powerful politician and won. James Whitfield was one of the first to benefit. The fund provided him with 3 months of housing assistance while he recovered from his illness and applied for the VA benefits he should have received years ago. Today, he lives in a small apartment near the clubhouse, volunteering his time to help other veterans navigate the bureaucracy that had once left him homeless. Maria's aunt finally received the housing assistance she had been promised, though it came not from the government but from a private donor who had been inspired by Maria's courage. She now lives in a small house with a garden where she grows vegetables that she shares with her neighbors. Thomas's cousin Danny is still struggling, but he is no longer alone. The club connected him with a therapist who specializes in PTSD, and he has begun the long process of rebuilding his life. Some days are harder than others, but he knows that he has people who will not give up on him. Richard Harmon testified before a congressional committee investigating corruption in veterans services. His evidence contributed to reforms that made it harder for future politicians to exploit the system as Senator Bennington had done. His daughter, now 8 years old, told him she was proud of him. And Sarah Chen received a job offer from a national news organization, her career transformed by her role in exposing the scandal. She accepted, but only after making clear that she would continue covering the issues that affected communities like Ridgewood, the stories that too often went untold. Senator Harold Bennington awaited trial in a minimum security facility, his political career destroyed, his reputation in ruins. His wife had filed for divorce. His donors had abandoned him. The empire he had built on lies had crumbled to dust. But Marcus took no satisfaction in the senator's downfall. Revenge had never been the point. Justice was not about punishment. It was about making things right. And there was still so much work to do. 1 year after the groundbreaking ceremony that never happened, a different kind of ceremony took place in Ridgewood. The lot where the fraudulent resource center had been planned to rise was now home to something real. The Ridgewood Veterans Community Center, built with funds recovered from the senator's scheme and donations from around the country. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the ribbon was cut. The new center was modest by some standards, a single-story building with a simple design, but it was functional and, more importantly, it was honest. Inside were offices for caseworkers who would actually help veterans. There were classrooms for job training programs that would actually train people. There was a small kitchen where meals would be served to those who needed them. It was everything the senator had promised and never delivered. Elena found him as the crowd began to disperse. "You should have been up on that stage," she said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "This was never about me. It was about them." He nodded toward the veterans who were exploring the new facility, their faces lit with genuine hope. "They are the ones who matter." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You are a good man, Marcus Cole, even if you will never admit it." He laughed, a rare sound that Elena treasured. "I am just a biker who got lucky." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But I am proud of what we built here. Not just the building, the community, the trust." He looked out at the mountains that surrounded the town. "We showed people that they do not have to accept corruption, that they can stand up and fight back, that if they do, they might actually win." Elena nodded. "And what is next?" Marcus considered the question. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront, more politicians who saw veterans as props rather than people. But today, in this moment, there was peace. "Next," he said finally, "we ride." They walked together to where the motorcycles were parked, gleaming in the autumn sunlight. The other members of the club were already gathering, their engines rumbling to life one by one. The sound echoed off the surrounding hills, a thunder that had once frightened the people of Ridgewood, but now represented something different entirely. It represented protection, purpose, brotherhood. As Marcus mounted his motorcycle, he paused to look back at the community center one last time. Through the windows, he could see James Whitfield helping an elderly veteran fill out paperwork. He could see Maria laughing with a group of young veterans who had just arrived. He could see Thomas explaining something to a child who had wandered in with her father. This was the legacy of what they had done. Not the downfall of a corrupt politician, though that mattered too, but the building of something better, the creation of a community that cared for its own. The engine roared to life beneath him, and Marcus pulled out onto the road, Elena beside him and the rest of the club following behind. They rode through the streets of Ridgewood, past the diner where they gathered for coffee, past the old mill that was being converted into affordable housing for veterans, past the community center where their flag now flew alongside the American flag. The people of the town waved as they passed, some with enthusiasm, others with quiet respect. A year ago, many of these same people had feared the bikers. Now they understood that the leather and the chrome and the thunder were just the surface. Beneath it all were men and women who had sworn an oath to protect those who could not protect themselves. The convoy left the town behind and climbed into the mountains, following roads that twisted through forests blazing with autumn color. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of winter. Above them, the sky was the deep blue of late October, unmarked by clouds. They rode for hours, stopping occasionally at overlooks where they could survey the land below. From up here, the world seemed simpler somehow. The petty corruptions and bureaucratic failures faded into insignificance. All that mattered was the road ahead and the brothers and sisters who rode beside you. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the convoy stopped at a small campsite deep in the mountains. It was a place the club had used for years, a clearing beside a stream where they could gather around a fire and share stories as their ancestors had done for thousands of years. That night, as the flames crackled and the stars emerged one by one, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them here, not just the past year, but his entire life. The wars he had fought, the friends he had lost, the promises he had made to himself in the darkest moments. He had wondered sometimes if any of it mattered, if the sacrifices were worth the cost, if the world could ever really be changed. Now, watching his brothers and sisters gathered around the fire, he knew the answer. It mattered because they made it matter. Every act of kindness, every stand against injustice, every time they chose to help instead of looking away. None of it was wasted, none of it was forgotten. The world was not perfect, and it never would be. But it was a little better because they were in it, and that was enough. Maria raised a bottle in the firelight. "To James," she said, "and to everyone we could not save, and to everyone we will save tomorrow." The others echoed the toast, the sound of their voices rising into the night. "To brotherhood," Marcus added, "and to the road ahead." They drank together, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed lighter. The night deepened around them, and the fire burned lower, but the warmth remained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight they rested, surrounded by people who had proven their loyalty not through words, but through actions. Senator Harold Bennington had asked a group of bikers for help, and he had regretted ever trying to deceive them. But that was not the real story. The real story was about the people who had been failed by the system and found hope in unexpected places. The real story was about courage in the face of corruption and community in the face of isolation. The real story was about what happened when ordinary people decided to stand up for what was right. And that story, Marcus knew, was just beginning. The morning after the campfire gathering, the convoy prepared to ride back to Ridgewood. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles and checked their gear, Marcus noticed a young woman standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked nervous, uncertain, clutching a piece of paper in her hands. He approached her slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Can I help you?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "I heard what you did," she said. "For the veterans, for the community." She held out the paper, and Marcus saw that it was a letter, worn from being folded and unfolded many times. "My father wrote this before he passed away last year. He was a veteran. He tried to get help from that initiative." She swallowed hard. He never got it. He waited, and then one day, he just gave up. Marcus took the letter carefully, his heart heavy. He did not need to read it to understand what it said. He had seen too many letters like it, too many veterans who had lost hope because the people they trusted had betrayed them. "What was his name?" Marcus asked. "Robert," the young woman replied. "Robert Simmons. He served in the Gulf War. He was my hero." Marcus handed the letter back to her. "Your father was a good man," he said, "and he deserved better than what he got." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "We cannot change what happened, but we can make sure it does not happen to anyone else. That is what we are trying to do." The young woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. That is why I came." She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "I want to help. I want to volunteer at the new center. I want to be there for the people who are going through what my father went through." Marcus studied her for a moment, seeing in her face the same determination that had driven him and his brothers and sisters to stand against the senator. She had lost something precious, but she had not let that loss break her. Instead, she had chosen to turn her pain into purpose. "Come with us," he said. "We will introduce you to the people who run the center. They could use someone like you." She smiled through her tears, and for a moment Marcus saw a glimpse of the father she had lost, the warrior who had passed his courage on to his daughter. The convoy returned to Ridgewood, and the young woman rode behind Thomas, her arms wrapped around his waist as they descended from the mountains. By the time they reached the community center, word had spread that someone new was joining the effort, and the staff was waiting to greet her. Marcus watched as she was embraced by the volunteers, as she found a place among people who understood her loss. She would heal here, he thought. And in healing, she would help others heal as well. That was how change happened. Not through grand gestures or political speeches, but through small acts of connection, one person reaching out to another, building a web of support that could not be broken. The sun was setting again when Marcus finally returned to the clubhouse. The other members had dispersed to their homes, their jobs, their lives. But Elena was waiting for him on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "Long day," she said, handing him one of the cups. He took it gratefully, settling into the chair beside her. "Long year." They sat in companionable silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky. The stars began to emerge, the same stars that had watched over this land for millennia, indifferent to the struggles of the tiny creatures below. "Do you ever wonder what happens next?" Elena asked quietly. Marcus considered the question. "I used to," he admitted. "When I first came home from the war, I could not see anything beyond the next day. The past was too painful to remember, and the future was too uncertain to imagine." He took a sip of his coffee. "But now, I think I understand. There is no end point, no final victory. Life is just a series of moments, each one offering a choice between standing up and looking away. And you always stand up." He smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "I try. Sometimes I fail. But I try." Elena nodded, satisfied with his answer. She had known Marcus for nearly 2 decades, since they had served together in a unit that felt like another lifetime. She had watched him struggle with the demons that followed him home, had seen him at his lowest moments, had believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself, and she had watched him become the man he was today, a leader, a protector, a brother in every sense that mattered. "Whatever happens next," she said, "we face it together." He raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. Together. They sat on the porch until the last light had faded and the stars blazed overhead, countless points of light in an infinite darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a lone motorcycle engine rumbled to life, its sound echoing off the mountains. And Marcus Cole, president of the Iron Brotherhood, veteran of wars both foreign and domestic, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt peace. The next morning brought new challenges, as mornings always do. A veteran called the clubhouse asking for help with a landlord who was trying to evict him. A single mother reached out, seeking resources for her son who was struggling with the transition back to civilian life. A reporter called, wanting to do a follow-up story on the community center's first anniversary. Marcus handled each situation with the same calm determination that had seen him through war zones and Senate hearings alike. He made calls, connected people with resources, listened when listening was what was needed. He was not a politician or a bureaucrat. He was simply a man who saw people in need and refused to look away. By afternoon, he was back on his motorcycle, riding through the streets of Ridgewood on his way to a meeting at the VA hospital. The facility had finally implemented some of the reforms recommended in the wake of the senator's scandal, and Marcus had been invited to speak to a group of newly hired staff members about what veterans actually needed, not from politicians or programs, but from the people who were supposed to help them. It was a small thing, perhaps. One meeting among thousands. One voice in a conversation that spanned the entire country. But Marcus had learned long ago that small things mattered, that the world was changed not by grand gestures, but by countless tiny acts of courage, each one building on the last. He parked his motorcycle in the hospital lot and walked through the automatic doors, past the waiting room filled with men and women who had served their country and now waited for the country to serve them in return. A young nurse approached him, her expression a mixture of nervousness and admiration. "Mr. Cole, the staff is waiting for you in the conference room." Marcus nodded, falling into step beside her. "And thank you," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For being here. For doing this work." He paused at the door to the conference room. "It matters more than you know." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Marcus spoke about his own experiences, about the veterans he had known who had fallen through the cracks, about the simple things that made the difference between despair and hope. He answered questions honestly, even when the answers were uncomfortable. He told them that they would fail sometimes, that the system was broken in ways that could not be fixed overnight, that they would lose people despite their best efforts. But he also told them that their work mattered, that every veteran they helped was a victory, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. When the meeting ended, several of the staff members lingered to shake his hand and thank him for coming. A young counselor, barely out of graduate school, asked if she could visit the community center and learn more about what the Iron Brotherhood was doing. An older doctor, a veteran himself, simply nodded in silent understanding, one warrior recognizing another. Marcus returned to his motorcycle as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking out at the mountains that surrounded the valley. A year ago, Senator Harold Bennington had stood on a stage and made promises he never intended to keep. He had seen the Iron Brotherhood as tools to be used and discarded. He had underestimated the power of ordinary people who refused to accept corruption as the price of doing business. Now the senator was awaiting trial, his empire in ruins. And in his place, something real had risen. Not perfect, not complete, but real. That was the difference, Marcus thought. The senator had built his career on illusions, on promises that sounded good but meant nothing. The Iron Brotherhood built on truth, on actions that spoke louder than any speech, on bonds that could not be broken by money or power or political maneuvering. The engine roared to life and Marcus pulled out onto the road, heading home. Behind him, the hospital continued its work. Ahead of him, the clubhouse waited, filled with brothers and sisters who had proven their loyalty 100 times over. And somewhere out there, in small towns and big cities across the country, other ordinary people were making extraordinary choices. Standing up when they could have looked away. Speaking out when they could have stayed silent. Building communities that cared for their own. That was the real legacy of what had happened in Ridgewood. Not the downfall of a corrupt politician, though that mattered too, but the proof that change was possible, that the powerful could be held accountable, that the forgotten could be remembered. Senator Bennington had asked a group of bikers for help, and he had regretted ever trying to deceive them. But in the end, his deception had accomplished something he never intended. It had awakened a community. It had inspired a movement. It had reminded people everywhere that they did not have to accept the world as it was. They could fight for the world as it should be. And that was exactly what Marcus Cole and the Iron Brotherhood intended to keep doing for as long as it took, for as many people as they could reach, until the very end. If you watched this far, it is because this story touched something deep inside you. Because you believe that truth matters, that courage matters, that the bonds we forge with each other are stronger than any corruption or deception. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far so I can get to know you and know who really loves these stories." Hit that like button if this story made you feel something real. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that there are still good people in this world fighting for what is right. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel. Join our brotherhood. Together, we are stronger. Sometimes the smallest voice can save the biggest soul. Sometimes one person standing up can inspire 1,000 others to do the same. And sometimes, the people who look the roughest on the outside are the ones with the softest hearts. Brotherhood never ends. Honor does not retire. And the road ahead is waiting.